Sarah Mitchell sat in the bustling courthouse, her fingers nervously adjusting the silk scarf she had brought but chosen not to wear. The mahogany benches creaked beneath her as she organized the thick stack of documents on her lap. At 42, she had handled dozens of high-profile cases, but this one was different. It wasn't just about the law anymore, it was personal. The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 7 reflected off her bare scalp, a stark reminder of the 6 months of chemotherapy she had endured. Just last week, her oncologist had warned her about taking on such a stressful case, but Sarah couldn't step away. Not when she knew what the Henderson Pharmaceutical Company had done to the residents of Pine Grove. As she watched families file into the courtroom, Sarah recalled the day she first visited the small community. The stories she heard there haunted her. Children with rare cancers, elderly residents developing mysterious illnesses, and an alarming number of miscarriages. The connection seemed clear. All of these health issues had started appearing after Henderson Pharmaceuticals began their operations in the area. All rise. The Honorable Judge Harold Thompson presiding. The bailiff's voice boomed through the room. Sarah stood, her legs slightly shaky. The morning's chemotherapy session had left her more drained than usual, but she refused to show any weakness. Across the aisle, Henderson Pharmaceuticals' legal team, 5 lawyers in expensive suits from one of the city's most prestigious firms, exchanged confident smiles. They had already tried to settle the case 3 times, offering increasingly larger sums to make it go away quietly. Judge Thompson entered, his gray hair neatly combed, his black robe pristine. He was known for his no-nonsense attitude and traditional views. As he took his seat, his eyes swept across the courtroom, posing briefly on Sarah's bare head. Something that looked like amusement flickered across his face. "I see the plaintiff's counsel has decided to make quite a statement with their appearance today," Judge Thompson remarked, causing several people to snicker. "I trust this won't be a distraction from the proceedings." Sarah's back stiffened, but her voice remained steady as she replied, "No, Your Honor. The only statement I intend to make is through the evidence we gathered." She could feel the stares from everyone in the courtroom. Some were pitying, others curious, and a few, particularly from the opposition's table, were dismissive. 6 months ago, she might have been mortified by this attention. Now, she had bigger concerns. Opening her first folder, Sarah glanced at the photograph inside. 7-year-old Emily Carter, one of Pine Grove's youngest cancer patients, smiling despite having lost her hair to the same brutal treatment Sarah was experiencing. The image strengthened her resolve. The corporate lawyers across the aisle were whispering among themselves, occasionally throwing condescending looks her way. They probably thought she was weakened, an easy target. What they didn't know was that fighting cancer had made her stronger, more determined than ever. Sarah had spent countless hours in the chemotherapy ward preparing this case, using the time between treatments to review documents, analyze data, and build an airtight argument. While the poison dripped into her veins to fight her cancer, she had been fighting to expose the poison Henderson Pharmaceuticals had been dumping into Pine Grove's soil. As Judge Thompson began reviewing the preliminary motions, Sarah noticed him watching her with barely concealed amusement, especially when she reached for her water bottle with slightly shaking hands. The message was clear. He had already decided what kind of lawyer she was: weak, sick, possibly seeking sympathy rather than justice. But Sarah Mitchell had learned something valuable during her battle with cancer. Appearances meant nothing. Strength came in many forms, and sometimes the most powerful weapon was being underestimated by your opponents. She organized her papers one final time, each document representing a piece of the devastating puzzle she was about to present. The evidence was solid, the witnesses were ready, and her strategy was flawless. Let them laugh. Let them smirk. Let them think her illness had dulled her legal acumen. By the time this trial was over, they would understand that cancer hadn't weakened Sarah Mitchell. It had given her an intimate understanding of what was at stake for the families of Pine Grove. And more importantly, it had given her nothing left to lose. As the first session was about to begin, Sarah straightened her spine and opened her briefcase. The real battle was about to start, and she was more than ready for it. The morning session began with Judge Thompson making little effort to hide his disdain. Every time Sarah stood to speak, he would touch his own full head of gray hair or adjust his reading glasses, smirking slightly as he did so. The message was clear. He found her appearance amusing, a distraction from the serious nature of his courtroom. Miss Mitchell, Judge Thompson interrupted her opening statement. Perhaps you'd like to take a moment to compose yourself? You seem a bit unsteady. His voice carried a mocking concern that made several members of the opposition's legal team snicker behind their expensive leather portfolios. Sarah gripped the podium tighter, but kept her voice steady. I'm quite composed, Your Honor. If I may continue outlining the evidence of Henderson Pharmaceuticals' negligent waste disposal practices. By all means, the judge replied, leaning back in his chair with an exaggerated wave of his hand. Though I must say, you seem rather invested in this case. Personal experience clouding your judgment, perhaps. The opposing counsel, led by James Barrett from the prestigious firm of Barrett and Wallace, jumped at the opening. Your Honor, we share your concerns about Ms. Mitchell's ability to maintain objectivity, given her obvious situation. Sarah watched as Judge Thompson nodded thoughtfully at Barrett's words, as if they were sharing some private joke at her expense. The courtroom had become a stage for their casual cruelty, with her illness serving as their source of entertainment. When Sarah began presenting her first set of documents, Judge Thompson interrupted again. Miss Mitchell, are you sure you're reading those numbers correctly? Chemotherapy brain, isn't that what they call it? He chuckled, and several others in the courtroom joined in. The corporate lawyers exchanged satisfied glances. They clearly thought they had already won, believing that the judge's obvious bias would work in their favor. Sarah noticed how they barely bothered to take notes, treating the proceedings as a mere formality. But what they didn't see was the fire burning in Sarah's eyes. Each dismissive comment, each mocking laugh, only fueled her determination. She had spent too many nights in hospital rooms, researching similar cases and building her strategy to let their prejudice derail her now. Your Honor, Sarah said, her voice carrying a quiet strength that made several people sit up straighter, I have the medical records of 37 children from Pine Grove. Would you like to make jokes about their hair loss as well? The judge's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Watch your tone, Ms. Mitchell. This court won't tolerate emotional manipulation. Nothing emotional about facts, Your Honor, Sarah replied, pulling out another document. Just like there's nothing emotional about the soil sample reports I'm about to present. Barrett stood up, straightening his $1,000 tie. Your Honor, opposing counsel is clearly trying to play on sympathies rather than present actual evidence. Judge Thompson nodded. Indeed, Mr. Barrett. Ms. Mitchell, this isn't a charity fundraiser. If you can't maintain professional decorum. Sarah cut him off by placing a thick binder on the evidence table with a solid thump. You're right, Your Honor. This isn't about charity or sympathy. This is about law, evidence, and justice. And if my appearance is so distracting, perhaps we should focus on the appearance of the toxic waste in Pine Grove's water supply instead? A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even some of the corporate lawyers stopped smirking and started flipping through their papers with more urgency. Judge Thompson's amused expression flickered again, this time replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. Sarah used their momentary discomfort to press forward, her voice growing stronger with each word. She had expected their mockery, had prepared for it, had even counted on it. While they were busy laughing at her appearance, they had missed the steel in her spine and the determination in her heart. As the morning session drew to a close, Sarah could feel a subtle shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. The opposition's casual confidence had developed a crack, and Judge Thompson's smugness had dimmed slightly. They had spent so much time judging her by her appearance that they had forgotten to watch for the legal trap she was methodically laying. Sarah packed up her documents for the lunch recess, hiding a small smile. Let them laugh. The real surprise was still to come, and by the time she was done, no one would be amused by her appearance. They would be too busy facing the consequences of their actions. After the lunch break, Sarah Mitchell began methodically presenting her evidence. The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted from earlier mockery to growing tension as she unveiled document after document. Despite her fatigue from the morning's chemotherapy, her hands remained steady as she presented her first key piece of evidence. Exhibit A, Sarah announced, her voice clear and strong, shows soil samples taken from 10 different locations around Pine Grove. Each sample contains levels of toxic chemicals that exceed federal safety standards by over 300%. She placed the enlarged charts on the display board, the red warning indicators impossible to ignore. The corporate lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. James Barrett, their lead counsel, frantically whispered to his colleagues. These samples, Sarah continued, were collected and analyzed by 3 independent laboratories. She walked slowly across the courtroom, her bare head held high. Each lab reached the same conclusion. The chemical composition matches exactly with the waste products from Henderson Pharmaceuticals' manufacturing process. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his earlier amusement replaced by focused attention. And you can prove these chemicals came specifically from Henderson's facility? Yes, Your Honor. Sarah pulled out another set of documents. The chemical signature is unique to their patented drug manufacturing process. There's no other possible source within a 100-mile radius. As she presented her evidence, Sarah felt a wave of nausea hit her, a common side effect of her treatment. She gripped the podium tightly but didn't pause. She had practiced this presentation countless times during her sleepless nights in the hospital, and she wasn't about to let physical discomfort derail her now. The families from Pine Grove sat in the gallery, many of them wearing green ribbons in support of their cause. Among them was Lisa Carter, Emily's mother, clutching a photograph of her daughter. Sarah drew strength from their presence as she continued her presentation. Furthermore, Sarah said, pulling out a thick binder, we have documented every instance of illegal dumping over the past 5 years. Our team photographed Henderson's trucks disposing of waste during nighttime hours, away from their designated facilities. The opposition's table erupted in whispered conversations. This was evidence they hadn't anticipated. Barrett stood up, his confidence visibly shaken. Objection, Your Honor. We weren't provided with these photographs during discovery. Sarah smiled slightly. Actually, Mr. Barrett, they were included in the 3rd batch of documents we sent to your office. Page 847, subsection C. I have the signed receipt right here. Judge Thompson examined the receipt Sarah provided, his earlier condescending attitude completely gone. Objection overruled. The evidence was properly submitted. Sarah then moved to her most compelling evidence yet. She projected a map onto the courtroom screen, showing Pine Grove and its surrounding areas. Red dots indicated each reported case of cancer and other serious illnesses. As you can see, Your Honor, the concentration of cases forms a clear pattern. The highest number of incidents occurs within a 1-mile radius of Henderson's disposal sites, with numbers decreasing as you move further away. The courtroom had grown completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers had ceased as everyone stared at the damning pattern on the screen. Sarah had spent months creating this presentation, working on her laptop during chemotherapy sessions, cross-referencing medical records with geographical data. We have testimony from former Henderson employees, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger despite her physical exhaustion. They will confirm under oath that the company knew about these dangerous disposal practices but chose to continue them to save money. Judge Thompson was now taking his own notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. The smirks and laughter from the morning session seemed like a distant memory. As Sarah concluded her presentation, she noticed Barrett frantically sending messages on his phone, likely calling for reinforcements from his law firm. The other corporate lawyers were buried in their documents, searching for ways to counter her evidence. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had deliberately held back her strongest evidence, saving it for the perfect moment. While her opponents might think she had shown her full hand, she knew the real bombshell was still to come. Looking at the families in the gallery, Sarah saw hope replacing fear in their eyes. She had promised them justice, and despite the judge's initial mockery, despite her own physical struggles, she was delivering on that promise. The truth was emerging, one document at a time, and no amount of prejudice or corporate power could stop it now. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy as Sarah Mitchell began revealing photographs of the children affected by Henderson Pharmaceuticals' toxic waste. Her first exhibit was a picture of Emily Carter, taken just 3 months ago. Emily Carter, age 7, Sarah announced, her voice steady. Diagnosed with an extremely rare form of leukemia, according to medical experts. Judge Thompson's face lost its last trace of amusement as he studied the photograph. Emily's brave smile, despite her bald head and pale complexion, seemed to strike something deep within him. He glanced at Sarah, then back at the photo, the parallel impossible to ignore. In the past 3 years, Sarah continued, Pine Grove has reported 15 cases of childhood cancer. The national average for a town this size is less than one case every 5 years. She placed more photographs on the display board, each showing a different child battling illness. The corporate lawyers squirmed in their seats as Sarah presented a comprehensive soil analysis map. These samples were taken from the children's playgrounds, schoolyards, and local parks. Every single location showed dangerous levels of contamination. James Barrett stood up, his voice less confident than before. Your Honor, these photographs, while unfortunate, don't prove any direct link to our client's activities. Sarah was prepared for this objection. She pulled out a thick folder filled with medical reports. These documents show that each child's blood work contains elevated levels of specific chemical markers that match perfectly with Henderson's waste products. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah displayed a series of graphs tracking the rise in illness rates. The correlation between Henderson's dumping activities and the increase in cancer cases was undeniable. Your Honor, Sarah said, walking closer to the bench, I'd like to present our next witness, Dr. Helen Morgan, Chief Oncologist at Pine Grove Children's Hospital. Dr. Morgan, a distinguished-looking woman in her 50s, took the stand. Her testimony was devastating. She explained in clear, simple terms how the unusual cluster of cancer cases had first caught her attention, and how her investigation led her to suspect environmental causes. In my 25 years of practice, Dr. Morgan stated firmly, I've never seen anything like this. The type and concentration of these cancer cases cannot be explained by random chance. Judge Thompson leaned forward, fully engaged. His earlier prejudice seemed forgotten as he asked detailed questions about the medical evidence. Sarah noticed how he no longer looked at her with contempt but with growing respect. The corporate lawyers' table was in disarray. Papers were scattered everywhere as they desperately searched for ways to counter this testimony. Barrett kept sending urgent messages on his phone, likely calling for backup from his firm. Sarah pressed on, despite feeling another wave of fatigue. She had timed this presentation carefully, knowing that the human impact of these photographs and testimonies would be impossible to dismiss. Your Honor, she said, pulling out one final photograph, I'd like to submit this aerial image taken by a local environmental group. The photograph showed Henderson's facility at night, with trucks clearly visible dumping waste in restricted areas. The evidence was mounting, and the shift in the courtroom was palpable. The families in the gallery were holding hands, some wiping away tears as they saw their struggles being validated through hard evidence. Judge Thompson studied each piece of evidence with increasing concern. His eyes kept returning to the photographs of the children, then moving to Sarah, as if seeing her in a completely new light. Ms. Mitchell, he said, his voice notably softer than before, how many more witnesses do you have prepared to testify about these findings? We have 12 more witnesses, Your Honor, Sarah replied, including 3 former Henderson employees who will testify about the company's intentional concealment of their disposal practices. Barrett jumped up again. Your Honor, we need time to review and verify all this new information. But Judge Thompson waved him off. Mr. Barrett, your client has had ample time to address these issues. We will proceed as scheduled. Sarah gathered her strength for the next phase of the trial. The judge's change in attitude was significant, but she knew the real battle was just beginning. Henderson Pharmaceuticals would fight back hard, but she had more evidence to present. Evidence that would make what she'd shown so far look like just the tip of the iceberg. As the afternoon session drew to a close, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the courtroom's window reflection. She saw not a cancer patient, but a fighter for justice, and she knew that finally, others were beginning to see it too. The courtroom tensed as Henderson Pharmaceuticals' environmental safety expert, Dr. Robert Wilson, took the stand. He sat confidently, adjusting his expensive tie, clearly prepared to defend the company's practices. Sarah Mitchell rose slowly from her seat, her own experience with cancer giving her a unique perspective on what she was about to do. Dr. Wilson, Sarah began, her voice clear and steady, you've testified that Henderson's waste disposal methods meet all safety requirements. Is that correct? Yes, that's absolutely correct, he replied, smiling at the judge. Our protocols exceed federal guidelines. Sarah picked up a document from her table. Could you please read the highlighted portion of this internal memo? It's dated 3 months before the first child in Pine Grove was diagnosed with cancer. Dr. Wilson's smile faltered as he read the memo. It states that our filtration systems were operating at 40% below required standards. And yet you certified them as safe, didn't you? Sarah pressed, taking a few steps closer to the witness stand. Just like you certified the water quality tests as acceptable, despite knowing about elevated toxin levels. The expert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Barrett jumped up to object, but Sarah was already moving to her next point. She pulled out a calendar marked with 2 distinct sets of dates. Dr. Wilson, these red marks show your inspection dates. The blue marks show when Henderson conducted their heavy waste disposal. Interesting how they never overlap, isn't it? The courtroom murmured as the pattern became clear. Sarah continued, her own experience with medical treatments adding weight to her words. As someone who has spent countless hours in chemotherapy, I'm particularly interested in your assessment of these cancer-causing agents. She placed a medical chart on the display board. This shows the chemical composition of the drugs I received during my treatments. Notice anything familiar about these compounds? Dr. Wilson's face paled. The chemical structures matched exactly with those found in the soil samples from Pine Grove. Well, there might be some similarities, he stammered. Some similarities? Sarah's voice grew stronger. They're identical to the waste products your company dumped near children's playgrounds. The same chemicals that are now showing up in their blood tests. Judge Thompson leaned forward, fully engaged. His earlier mockery of Sarah's condition had transformed into evident respect for her precise dismantling of the expert's testimony. Sarah moved to her most powerful point. Dr. Wilson, when you certified these disposal sites as safe, did you know that these chemicals become 300% more toxic when they interact with groundwater? That's not. He started, but Sarah was ready. She produced another document. This is your own research paper from 2020, where you specifically detailed this interaction. The same paper Henderson Pharmaceuticals paid to have withdrawn from publication. The corporate lawyers erupted in frantic whispers. Barrett was practically jumping out of his seat, but the damage was done. Dr. Wilson's credibility was crumbling. One final question, Sarah said, pulling out a photograph of Emily Carter. Would you be willing to let your own children play in the parks you certified as safe? The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Wilson looked at the photo, then at Sarah, and finally dropped his gaze. No, he whispered. No, I wouldn't. Sarah returned to her seat, fighting back a wave of fatigue. Her personal battle with cancer had taught her to read medical reports, understand chemical interactions, and most importantly, recognize when experts were hiding the truth. Judge Thompson was now watching Dr. Wilson with obvious disapproval. The expert's testimony, meant to be Henderson's strongest defense, had instead revealed the depth of their negligence. The families in the gallery were wiping away tears, finally seeing justice being served. Sarah felt their eyes on her, no longer filled with pity for her condition, but with gratitude and admiration for her thorough exposure of the truth. As the session ended, Barrett requested a recess to review their position. Sarah noticed Judge Thompson watching her with newfound respect as she packed up her documents. Her illness, which they had all mocked earlier, had given her the unique insight needed to unravel their deception. Sarah knew there was more to come, but this cross-examination had been crucial. She had shown that Henderson's expert wasn't just wrong, he had been complicit in hiding the truth. And she had done it not despite her cancer, but partly because of what it had taught her about the real human cost of corporate negligence. The turning point in the trial came when Sarah Mitchell revealed her most damaging evidence yet, internal company emails that Henderson Pharmaceuticals had fought desperately to keep hidden. The courtroom fell completely silent as she began presenting them. Your Honor, Sarah said, standing straight despite her exhaustion, what you're about to see proves that Henderson's executives knew exactly what they were doing to the people of Pine Grove. She projected the first email onto the large courtroom screen. It was from Henderson's CEO to the board of directors, dated 2 years before the first cancer diagnosis in Pine Grove. The message was clear and damning. Proper disposal costs too much. The alternative site near Pine Grove will save us millions. Local testing is minimal. Unlikely anyone will notice. Judge Thompson's face darkened as he read the words. Gone was any trace of his earlier amusement at Sarah's condition. He leaned forward, examining each email with intense concentration. Sarah moved to the next piece of evidence. This email chain shows Henderson's environmental team warning management about the risks. They specifically mentioned the possibility of increased cancer rates in the surrounding areas. The corporate lawyers were now in complete disarray. James Barrett kept trying to object, but each time Sarah simply responded by showing another damaging email. The evidence was overwhelming. Most disturbing of all, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, is this message from 6 months ago. She displayed an email that made several people in the gallery gasp. It showed Henderson's executives discussing how to hide the growing number of cancer cases in Pine Grove. Judge Thompson removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes as if trying to process what he was seeing. Ms. Mitchell, these emails appear to show a deliberate attempt to conceal criminal activity. How did you obtain them? Sarah smiled slightly. During my chemotherapy sessions, Your Honor, I had a lot of time to review documents. I noticed patterns in Henderson's official communications that didn't add up. That led me to subpoena their internal servers, where these emails were found hidden in encrypted folders. The gallery erupted in whispers. Barrett jumped to his feet. Your Honor, we object to the authenticity of these emails. The authenticity has already been verified by 3 independent digital forensics experts, Sarah responded calmly. Their reports are included in Exhibit F. Judge Thompson nodded, his expression grave. He was now looking at Sarah with unmistakable respect, perhaps remembering his own earlier mockery with shame. Sarah pressed on, revealing email after email that showed a clear pattern of deliberate negligence and cover-ups. She had organized them chronologically, painting a picture of corporate greed that had directly led to the suffering of Pine Grove's residents. This final email, Sarah said, projecting one last message, was sent just 1 week ago. It shows Henderson's executives discussing how to discredit me personally, suggesting they could use my illness to undermine my credibility in court. The irony was lost on no one. The very condition they had planned to use against her had given her the time and motivation to uncover their crimes. Judge Thompson's transformation was now complete. He looked at Sarah not as a sick woman to be pitied or mocked, but as a skilled attorney who had masterfully exposed the truth. His voice was firm as he addressed Barrett. Counselor, do you have any response to these emails? Barrett stood, his confidence shattered. Your Honor, we request a brief recess to confer with our clients. Granted, Judge Thompson replied. We'll reconvene in 1 hour. But before dismissing the court, he turned to Sarah. Ms. Mitchell, this is some of the most thorough investigative work I've seen in my courtroom. Well done. As people filed out for the recess, Sarah could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The families from Pine Grove were crying tears of joy and relief. The corporate lawyers were frantically making phone calls, and Judge Thompson kept glancing at her with what looked like admiration mixed with remorse. Sarah packed up her documents slowly, conserving her energy for what was to come. She had more evidence to present, but she knew these emails had been the turning point. They had transformed her from an object of ridicule to a force to be reckoned with. As she left the courtroom for the break, she overheard one of the junior lawyers whisper, "How did we not know she was this prepared?" Sarah smiled to herself. They had been so busy laughing at her appearance that they never saw the legal storm coming. Their prejudice had been their downfall, and justice for Pine Grove was finally within reach. The afternoon session began with Sarah Mitchell revealing her masterstroke, a comprehensive nationwide study she had conducted during her months of chemotherapy treatments. The corporate lawyers, already shaken by the morning's revelations, watched in growing dismay as she unveiled her findings. Your Honor, Sarah began, wheeling in a large display board. While receiving my treatments, I noticed something interesting. Pine Grove wasn't an isolated case. She revealed a map of the United States, marked with dozens of red dots. Each of these points represents a community near a Henderson Pharmaceuticals disposal site, and each one shows the same pattern of illness we've seen in Pine Grove. She displayed a series of charts showing identical chemical signatures in soil samples from different locations. The corporate legal team's table erupted in frantic whispers as they realized the scope of what they were facing. In each of these communities, Sarah continued, pointing to specific locations, cancer rates increased by at least 200% within 3 years of Henderson beginning their disposal operations. The chemical markers are identical in every case. Barrett jumped to his feet. Your Honor, This is beyond the scope of our current case. On the contrary, Sarah replied calmly, pulling out more documents. These findings demonstrate a systematic pattern of negligence that directly relates to Pine Grove. They proved this wasn't a simple oversight, it was corporate policy. She projected a series of internal memos onto the courtroom screen, each showing similar cost-cutting decisions made at different facilities. The evidence was overwhelming. Judge Thompson, who had started the trial mocking Sarah's appearance, was now taking detailed notes of every point she made. During my hospital stays, Sarah explained, her voice growing stronger despite her visible fatigue, I created a database linking Henderson's disposal practices to health outcomes in surrounding communities. The correlation is undeniable. She then revealed testimonies from doctors in other affected areas, all describing the same unusual patterns of illness they'd seen in Pine Grove. The corporate lawyers looked increasingly desperate as their defense crumbled. Sarah moved to her strongest point. Most importantly, Your Honor, I found evidence that Henderson used the same deceptive practices in every location. They consistently chose low-income communities, believing they wouldn't have the resources to fight back. The gallery erupted in murmurs as Sarah displayed internal communications showing Henderson's strategic targeting of vulnerable communities. Judge Thompson had to call for order several times as the implications sank in. Ms. Mitchell, the judge asked, how many total cases have you documented? Over 300 families affected across 15 states, Your Honor. Each case shows the same pattern of exposure and illness we've seen in Pine Grove. Sarah's voice carried the weight of all those families' stories. I prepared detailed documentation for each case, including medical records, soil samples, and testimony from local experts. Barrick made one last desperate attempt to object. Your Honor, we cannot verify all these claims in the current proceedings. Actually, Sarah responded, pulling out another folder, every piece of evidence has been independently verified by environmental agencies in each state. The reports are all here, properly notarized and certified. The corporate legal team's confidence had completely evaporated. They could see their carefully constructed defense being systematically destroyed by a lawyer they had initially dismissed because of her illness. Judge Thompson's transformation was complete. He now watched Sarah with obvious respect as she methodically presented each piece of evidence. The woman they had laughed at for her appearance had built an airtight case that went far beyond Pine Grove. Finally, Your Honor, Sarah said, revealing her last piece of evidence, I prepared a comprehensive analysis showing the total environmental and health impact of Henderson's practices across all affected communities. The financial cost alone exceeds $2 billion. The courtroom fell silent as the magnitude of her investigation became clear. Sarah had used her time battling cancer to expose not just one instance of corporate negligence, but an entire system of deliberate harm. As she concluded her presentation, even the corporate lawyers seemed to realize their case was lost. Sarah's work during her chemotherapy sessions had uncovered a pattern of behavior that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away. Judge Thompson called for a brief recess, but before leaving the bench, he looked at Sarah with newfound admiration. The woman they had ridiculed for her appearance had just delivered one of the most thorough legal presentations he had ever seen. The verdict came down like a thunderbolt. Judge Thompson's voice filled the packed courtroom as he delivered his ruling, his earlier prejudice completely transformed into deep respect for the case Sarah Mitchell had presented. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented by Ms. Mitchell, Judge Thompson announced, this court finds Henderson Pharmaceuticals guilty of criminal negligence and deliberate endangerment of public health. The company is ordered to pay $1.2 billion in damages to the affected families and immediately begin cleanup operations in all contaminated areas. The corporate lawyers sat in stunned silence as the judge continued listing the penalties. Henderson would be required to establish a medical fund for all affected families, covering their treatment costs for the next 30 years. Additionally, they would have to implement new waste disposal protocols under strict federal oversight. Sarah sat quietly at her table, conserving her strength but allowing herself a small smile. The families in the gallery behind her were crying and hugging each other, finally seeing justice after years of suffering. Furthermore, Judge Thompson added, his voice growing stern, I am referring this case to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution of Henderson's executive team. The evidence Ms. Mitchell uncovered shows clear criminal intent that must be addressed. Barrett and his team quickly gathered their papers, preparing to rush out and begin damage control. But before they could leave, Judge Thompson had one more announcement. The court will reconvene tomorrow to discuss the implementation of these orders. Ms. Mitchell will oversee the establishment of the medical fund to ensure it properly serves all affected communities. As the courtroom began to clear, Judge Thompson did something unprecedented. He stepped down from the bench and approached Sarah's table. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I owe you an apology. My behavior at the start of this trial was inexcusable. You have demonstrated exceptional legal skill and incredible dedication to justice." Sarah stood carefully, steadying herself against the table. "Thank you, Your Honor. The only thing that matters is that these families will finally get the help they need." The judge nodded, clearly moved by her grace. "What you accomplished here, especially while fighting your own battle, is remarkable. You've changed not just these families' lives, but you've changed how I will conduct my courtroom from now on." The families from Pine Grove surrounded Sarah, wanting to thank her personally. Emily Carter's mother hugged her tightly, whispering thank yous through her tears. Other cancer patients who had attended the trial approached her too, seeing her as a symbol of strength and persistence. As the courtroom emptied, one of the junior lawyers from Henderson's team lingered behind. He approached Sarah hesitantly. "Ms. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I wanted you to know that your presentation made me realize I'm working for the wrong side. I'll be resigning from the firm tomorrow." Sarah smiled warmly. There's always room for lawyers who want to fight for justice instead of profits. Later that evening, as Sarah packed up her files, Judge Thompson returned to the courtroom. He found her sitting quietly, looking at Emily Carter's photograph. "Ms. Mitchell," he said softly, "I want you to know that this case will serve as a teaching example in law schools, not just for its legal merits, but for how wrong we can be in judging others by their appearance." Sarah stood, gathering her strength for the walk out. "Perhaps my cancer was a blessing in disguise, Your Honor. It gave me the time and perspective to dig deeper than anyone else had before." The judge helped her with her briefcase. "How are your treatments progressing?" "3 more months," Sarah replied. "But now I can focus on healing, knowing these families will get the help they deserve." As they walked out of the courtroom together, Judge Thompson turned to her one last time. "Your legal brilliance wasn't just in the evidence you gathered, Ms. Mitchell. It was in letting us underestimate you. You turned our prejudice into your weapon." Sarah smiled. "Sometimes, Your Honor, the best way to fight injustice is to let people reveal their own biases. They never saw past my illness to realize I was building an airtight case." The setting sun streamed through the courthouse windows as they parted ways, casting long shadows that seemed to mark the end of one battle and the beginning of healing for hundreds of families across the nation. Thanks to Sarah Mitchell, justice had prevailed, and a powerful corporation had learned that appearance and illness had nothing to do with determination and legal brilliance. The judge's laughter had turned to respect, and more importantly, hundreds of families would now get the help they desperately needed.